Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. If I asked you to think of a scale, there's a good chance the one you'd pick would have 7 notes in it. The major scale does, as does the minor scale, and so does, well, honestly, those two are a huge part of modern music all on their own, so I'm not really sure I need any more examples. Heck, the idea of 7-note scales is baked right into the way we describe pitches. There's a reason we use the first 7 letters of the alphabet to name our notes. But this isn't some fundamental law of music or anything. Probably the most common counterexample is the pentatonic scales, which, as the name implies, have 5 notes. The major pentatonic and minor pentatonic both work by taking their respective scales and removing the most dissonant notes to create a calm, restful sound. But what if we don't want it to be completely dissonance-free? We've got 5-note scales and 7-note scales, what if we just split the difference with 6? 6-note scales are called hexatonic, and the most famous example of a hexatonic scale is probably the whole tone scale, which works by going up a whole step, then a whole step, then a whole step, then... well, you get the idea. We've talked about the whole tone scale before, but it's worth touching on again. By using only one interval to construct the entire thing, it creates a sense of ambiguity. You can't really nail down the root because no matter which note you start on, you get another whole tone scale. It's symmetrical, there's no obvious key center. Half steps are an important part of the way different notes interact, and by removing them entirely, it becomes hard to tell one note from another. Add to that the fact that the only chords you can construct are augmented triads, which are a fairly colorful sound in their own right, and it's pretty clear that the whole tone scale has a lot going on for something so simple. It's also the only 6-note scale without any half steps. Everything else has at least one, like the blues scale, which works by taking the minor pentatonic from earlier and slapping a note in between the 4th and 5th degrees to add back in some half steps and tritones and create a little dissonance in the otherwise very stable scale. As the name implies, it's popular in blues and blues-derived music, but it's actually only one of 2 6-note blues scales. It's more properly called the minor blues scale, and its partner is the major blues scale, which is the major pentatonic with an extra note between the 2nd and 3rd. Then there's the Prometheus scale, which is based on the mystic chord, a device used by Alexander Scriabin in many of his works, most famously Prometheus, a Poem of Fire. We've talked about the mystic chord and why it's so awesome before, so if you want to learn more about this scale, there's a link to that video in the description. There's plenty of other cool hexatonic scales out there, but probably the most interesting thing about them comes from one simple observation. 6 notes is 2 groups of 3 notes each. I know. Mind-blowing stuff. But 3 notes happens to be the size of our most common group of chords, the triads, so we can make all sorts of new hexatonic scales by smashing 2 unrelated triads together. I first encountered this technique in a series of articles by the guitarist Jimmy Brown, who outlined some of its more interesting results. For instance, if we take all the notes of D major and all the notes of E minor, we wind up with this scale, which is like a major scale but without the incredibly unstable 7th degree. It's still got the 4th, so it's not as stable as the major pentatonic, but it's a decent compromise between the two. But that's only if we take D as the root, and we don't have to do that. If we make E the root instead, we get this, which is like the minor scale but with no 6. The 6 in minor is normally flat, which means it's rubbing right up against the 5th, so removing it helps again to clear up some unwanted dissonance. And we can do this same thing with any 2 triads we want, as long as they have no notes in common. Another scale Brown described was what he called the sentimental scale, which you get by combining D major with E diminished. This is a lot like the major one from earlier, but with a lowered 6th, giving us a weird minor flavor on what is otherwise clearly a major scale. Then there's his leprechaun scale, which uses D major along with C major, to create a variation on the idea of a dominant scale, which is any scale with a major 3rd and a minor 7th. He's got plenty of other scale creations on this theme, and I've linked to his articles in the description, but before we finish, I'd like to talk about one last evolution of this idea, combining 3 different triads. Of course, that gives us 9 total notes, which breaks with our hexatonic theme, but if each of those triads has one note in common with each of the others, that knocks us back down to 6. A classic example of this can be seen in the Coltrane changes, which is based on 3 major triads, each a major 3rd apart, so like D major, F sharp major, and B flat major. If we combine all those notes together, we get this, called the augmented scale, because it can also be thought of as 2 augmented triads smashed together. 6-note scales pose some interesting problems. They're not quite as stable as pentatonics, but they don't have quite as much expressive range as their 7-note cousins either. They've each got a unique sound, but they're still a bit limited in how those sounds, well, sound. They're really fun toys to play with though, and there's plenty of them out there, so give them a shot. You might like what you find. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you want to help make these videos possible, please consider supporting 12 Tone on Patreon or checking out our store. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and keep on rockin'.